Christopher Nolan's masterful epic drama Oppenheimer took the world by storm when it released last summer, and it has followed up that critical and commercial success by sweeping the Oscars, netting wins for Best Picture, Best Actor, Best Supporting Actor, Best Director, Best Film Editing, Best Cinematography, and Best Original Score. I mean, goddamn.
As you'll no doubt know, Oppenheimer is an incredibly detailed, dense film. One which certainly rewards those who revisit it and pay close attention. It's also, as is unavoidable for any big-budget movie, one packed with its fair share of technical and factual mistakes, the latter being especially tricky where historical fare is concerned. So with that in mind, I'm Ewan, this is What Culture, and here are 15 things you somehow missed in Oppenheimer. Number 15. The Bugged Lamp. At first glance, you might assume this prop-related curiosity to be a mistake, but that's not the case at all. Between the first time we see Oppenheimer, Cillian Murphy, in Lyle Johnson's office, and the scene minutes later where he meets with Boris Pash, a terrifying Casey Affleck, in the very same office, the desk lamp has suddenly changed. But this is no continuity gap. Aside from the scenes taking place a day apart, this is actually a sly early indication that the government is spying on Oppenheimer, the lamp having been surreptitiously replaced with a recording device. Given that conversations Oppenheimer had in his office were ultimately used against him during his security hearings, it tracks that the switched-out lamp is how they got it done. And yet, at a casual glance, it seems like the prop master may have screwed something up. Number 14. The Oval Office set was borrowed from Veep. Okay, this is a fun one. The White House's Oval Office is obviously one of the world's most iconic locations, and Hollywood has gotten extremely good at replicating it for the big screen. But when it came to Oppenheimer, things got a bit tricky, as the original plan to shoot in California's Nixon Library fell through just a week before filming was scheduled to take place. And with Gary Oldman's availability being extremely limited, there was no way to move the shooting date back. But heroic Oscar-nominated production designer Ruth DeYoung saved the day by finding an existing Oval Office set. In fact, the same one used for HBO's hit political satire, Veep. DeYoung had her crew spend 5 days reassembling and repainting the set, while also building an adjoining lobby and cabinet room. Time proved to be so tight that, according to DeYoung herself, the paint was still wet when Oldman got on set. Some nice little rhyme there too. Though Oppenheimer and Veep's distinct visual styles make this a bit of a tough one to spot, you're indeed looking at the very same set where Julia Louis-Dreyfus's Selina Meyer actually sat. Number 13. Visible set lights in Gary Oldman's glasses. Bit ironic of us to point this out given you can see everything in my specs, but carrying on. While we're in the Oval Office, your eyes peeled on President Truman throughout his brief meeting with Oppenheimer. During the close-up shots, it's incredibly difficult not to notice the bright white set lights reflecting in his glasses. If you were lucky enough to see Oppenheimer in IMAX during its theatrical run, this was especially noticeable due to both the huge screen size and the detail-rich 65mm film Nolan shot the movie on. Reflections often create technical headaches for filmmakers and cinematographers too, and in extreme cases, they may even employ post-production techniques to erase unsightly telling reflections. In Nolan's case though, he's not much fond of digital post-production tinkering, and so evidently felt that it wasn't worth all the effort. All the same, you don't need to be that eagle-eyed to notice this, especially during close-ups of Gary Oldman's face. Number 12. The Gloved Hand. There's a detail you might have thought you noticed, but weren't actually sure about on an initial viewing. After Oppenheimer learns that his lover, Jean Tatlock, Florence Pugh, has taken her own life, he has numerous intrusive visions imagining her death. Though he initially pictures Jean taking sedatives and voluntarily submerging herself underwater in a bathtub, another brief flash shows a black gloved hand forcefully holding Tatlock's head under the water. This references the oft-disseminated theory that Tatlock was actually assassinated by intelligence officers working for the Manhattan Project. But given that the glove appears on screen for only around a second and the shot in question is rather darkly lit, you can certainly miss it on an initial viewing. Number 11. Cillian Murphy's ear piercings. This is firmly in nitpick territory, but all the same, in many close-up shots of Cillian Murphy's face, your attention might be drawn to the noticeable piercing holes visible in his left ear. Given that Oppenheimer himself didn't have pierced ears, although maybe he should have, it's pretty strong luck, this technically counts as a historical inaccuracy. And because we get so many close glimpses of Murphy's face doing this throughout the movie, there are plenty of opportunities for viewers to catch it. Again, Nolan is clearly more invested in the big picture than quibbling over things like this, especially as there likely wasn't an easy practical solution for covering up all those piercing holes. Between this and Nolan likely vetoing a post-production solution, it was simply a case of dealing with the quote-unquote mistake and hoping audiences would notice or just didn't care. Number 10. Teller's tie changes between scenes. Pierced ears are one thing, but wardrobe-related mistakes, while I don't really massively care, are a little bit more avoidable. Midway through the movie, theoretical physicist Edward Teller, Benny Safdie, who gives one of the best performances in the film, storms off after his hydrogen bomb plans are rejected, and Oppenheimer then chases after him to convince him to remain with the project. But the design of Teller's tie actually changes between him being inside the office in Los Alamos and heading outside. Originally, Teller's tie has many small silver stripes on it, whereas when he goes outside, there's just a single large stripe near the bottom. Beyond making it clear that these two sequences were almost certainly shot on different days, someone in the costume department seemingly made a mistake with keeping track of what Benny Safdie was wearing. Something happened to one of the ties, and this was the best replacement they had on hand. Number 9. Oppenheimer's bad Dutch. Early on in the film, Oppenheimer gives a lecture on quantum mechanics in Dutch, having spent 6 weeks learning the language in order to do so. For the scene, Cillian Murphy asked the film's Dutch-Swedish cinematographer, Pieter van Hoytema, to speak the required sentences so that he could play them back and learn them phonetically. To those who don't know the Dutch language, Murphy seems to do at least a passable job, though many Dutch-speaking viewers reported confusion during this scene that they couldn't understand what was being said as Murphy's garbled verbiage sounded a lot more like German. The gaffe went viral shortly after the film's release due to many feeling that such a mistake was surely beneath the exacting standards of a $100 million Christopher Nolan movie. And I mean, yeah, surely the better call here would have been to hire an actual language specialist? I don't know. Number 8. The black hole mistake. If you know much about black holes, you might well be aware that the term was coined in 1967 by Princeton physicist John Wheeler, many years after the primary events of Oppenheimer have concluded. And yet, roughly 30 minutes into the film, when Oppenheimer's paper on continued gravitational contraction is published in 1939, physicist Robert Serber shouts to him, "Your paper on black holes is in!" It would be almost another 3 decades before the term black hole was used, with scientists of the era typically referring to the phenomena instead as, quote, completely collapsed gravitational objects, which, yeah, doesn't really roll off the tongue quite as well as black hole. And in fairness to Nolan, this is perhaps less a mistake on his part than an attempt to streamline the audience's understanding of the scene in question. All the same, it's technically incorrect. The best kind of incorrect. Number 7. The reversed explosion. Though it doesn't come at the very end of the film, the climax in Oppenheimer is nevertheless the pivotal Trinity nuclear weapons test, where Oppenheimer and company witness the successful, ultimately world-changing culmination of their tireless work in the New Mexico desert. It's a spectacular sequence, the crowning glory of the film, and one which Nolan achieved primarily practically in camera, though certainly not without some editing chicanery. Case in point, just after Oppenheimer removes his goggles to get a look at the fiery mushroom cloud post-explosion, look closely and you can see that the shot of the fire has actually been reversed. Rather than the fire pluming into the sky, it can be briefly seen pulling downwards to the ground, which defies the laws of physics and make it clear we're watching rewound footage. This isn't a mistake as such, given that it was clearly done by Nolan with intention. perhaps simulating the brief obliteration of time as Oppenheimer's creation changes the world forever. Number 6. All the out-of-focus shots. The vast majority of Oppenheimer was shot with a wide aperture, creating a razor-thin depth of field in which characters are isolated from their environments, a pleasing cinematic background blur. And though Nolan often intentionally employs shifting focus throughout the film to depict Oppenheimer's frazzled mental state, and that's putting it lightly, there are also many scenes where focus is unintentionally soft. Again, this was most easily spotted during the film's theatrical release, especially on an IMAX screen. But in countless dialogue scenes full of close-ups, actors' faces are slightly out of focus. This is likely a result of Oppenheimer being shot on 65mm film with specialty lenses. Because while focus pullers can see crystal clear playback while shooting digitally, they're resigned to using a lower resolution video tap for film, where ascertaining clarity with a shallow depth of field becomes incredibly difficult, even for the most skilled focus pullers out there. And ultimately, it appears that Nolan preferred not to discard a brilliant take from an actor for the sake of some burst focus, which the vast majority of the audience would likely never even notice, or at least not even care about. Number 5. The Magic Tram. Much as Oppenheimer's production design and general attention to detail are nothing short of phenomenal, there is a pretty hilarious error when we see Oppenheimer heading to Gene's hotel. As he exits the cab and heads into the hotel, a tram can be seen passing behind him. At a momentary glance, it looks perfect, except that you look down at the street once the tram has passed. For a few seconds, it's clear that there are no tram lines on the road at all. Obviously, this mistake occurred because the shooting location didn't have tram lines, and so a prop car with wheels was simply used instead, with Nolan seemingly having little interest in having the tram lines added in post-production. If the cars along the street had been arranged just a little differently though, this would have been a lot tougher spot. Number 4. The visible boom mic operator. The Trinity test isn't the only boom we see in the movie, as when Louis Strauss, Robert Downey Jr., walks Oppenheimer to his car at roughly the movie's 2-hour 25-minute mark, a boom mic operator can be briefly seen. As Oppenheimer gets in the cab and the door slams, the shadowy outline of the boom operator holding the boom pole can be seen in the car door's reflection. Because the boom operator is standing in front of some of the set's lighting equipment, their silhouette is rather clearly illuminated on the window. As a result, you've got a pretty decent chance of catching this one yourself. Number 3. The US flags have too many stars. Here's a mistake that actually picked up a decent amount of traction online, and if you know your US flags, you might have noticed it yourself. When Oppenheimer gives a speech to those who worked on the Manhattan Project and are celebrated for his achievement, the US flags waved around during the scene have 50 stars on them, with each star representing one of the country's 50 different states, as you should all know. Except in 1945, when this scene takes place, the US only had 48 states, with Alaska and Hawaii only joining years later in 1959, and new 50-star flags first being introduced the year after. And so, the flags are historically inaccurate, which is almost strange given that other US flags shown in different scenes do indeed have the correct 48 stars on them. Does it break the movie? Of course not, but one of those where Grandpa Simpson's flag would maybe have come in handy. Number 2. The Ernest Lawrence mistake. Late in Oppenheimer, there's a strange fudging of the facts which many familiar with the actual Oppenheimer story even pointed out on social media. During the affecting sequence where an older Oppenheimer is presented with the Enrico Fermi Award in 1963, nuclear physicist Ernest Lawrence, Josh Hartnett, is briefly seen among the audience. Except Lawrence died 5 years earlier in 1958, and while one might jump to assume that Nolan somehow made a huge mistake, it's far more likely that he took deliberate artistic license. Given that the scene symbolically represents the scientific community circling back to Oppenheimer later in life, it's fitting that one of the film's more prominent faces is in the crowd, even if it isn't necessarily true to the facts of the day. And number 1. Emily Blunt's visible mic pack. And finally, at the tail end of the film, as Oppenheimer and his wife Kitty, Emily Blunt, walk back into their home hand in hand after the security hearing, a distinctive bump is noticeable on Blunt's back. Anyone who knows much about film production will likely realize that this is a receiver pack concealed under Blunt's cardigan for the lav microphone she's wearing for the scene. It's not the easiest spot in the world, but given that we get a pretty lingering glimpse of the pair walking off, the protrusion in her wardrobe is nevertheless noticeable if you're looking in the right place.